Welcome to Module 1, Introduction to Vectorworks. In this module we're going to learn how to work with the Vectorworks interface, learn how to control selection and snapping, learn how to control graphics, and we'll learn how to place text and dimensions. Lesson 1, the Vectorworks interface. In this lesson we're going to learn how to navigate our way around the Vectorworks interface. We're going to learn how to access tools and palettes. We'll learn how to set up the required units. We'll learn how to set up pages and areas for printing. And we'll learn how to create basic objects. So let's get into Vectorworks and we'll get started. Let's get started by looking at our Vectorworks interface, called the workspace. Before we go too far, tools on the menu bar, workspaces, and choose fundamentals. Now you might have a different set of workspaces here than I have. That doesn't matter. Please click on fundamentals. Now you will notice that the tools go away and they come back in maybe a different order. You might also notice that some tools don't reappear. That's because they're specific to a workspace. Let's start with the menu bar at the top of the screen. File, Edit, View, Modify, and so on. Now the idea of these is that they are fairly standard menu items. New, Open, Save, Close. These are the same on just about every computer program. Things get different after we go to Edit and View. One of the things you might notice is that under the View menu you might have something like an arrow here. We've got normal scale, fit to objects. Some menu commands have got a keyboard shortcut. That's what this is here. On a Macintosh, that's the command key. On a Windows machine, that will be the control key. Some commands have got these three little dots. They're called ellipses, and they will open a dialog box. Some commands are grayed out. They're just not appropriate, or we haven't got the right thing selected. Some commands have got a little tick. That means that they're activated. If I select that again, it will deactivate that option. That's the menu bar. When I go to the top of the screen and I say go to the Tools menu, I don't mean go to one of the palettes with tools on it. I mean go to the menu bar and choose Tools. This area where my cursor is at the moment, right across to the other side here, that is called my View bar. And it contains lots of pull down menus and lots of little buttons to control things for our view. Previous view, next view. Our classes and our active class. Our layers and our active layer. And we'll come back later on, we'll talk about classes and layers. Our working plane, fit to page area, fit to objects. These two are extremely useful. And right across to our viewing commands here. This is where we can choose what kind of rendered view we're in. This button at the very end here, it controls the options that we see on our view bar. So if you click on that, you can change some of those options. So we could add layer scale, for example, or we could take it away. The area underneath the view bar is called the toolbar, and these options here are called modes, and they will change whenever we change our tool. So when I choose my line tool, I get different options here. Back to my selection tool, and again I get different options. If you want to find out what these modes do, just leave your cursor over it and it will tell you. So wall insertion mode, rectangular marquee, lasso, and so on. On the far side of the toolbar are our quick preferences, zoom line thicknesses, data bar and edit options. If we click on this button at the end, it will open up a choice menu where we can choose what things we want to see. We might want to add drop shadows, or we might want to take away zoom line thickness. And we'll have a look at some of these in detail later on. But that is where we can choose our quick preferences. Once you've chosen a quick preference, you can then activate it or deactivate it by clicking on its icon. Let's have a look at our basic tool palette. Here's our basic tool palette here. It has our selection tool, pan tool, and so on. You might think of this as having most of the basic 2D tools on it. This cross here will close the basic toolset. If I drag the basic toolset, it will drag out. Now there's a big difference between a Macintosh and a PC when we come to add these palettes back together. You might notice on a Macintosh you get this blue area, and when I let go of my mouse, it then inserts my basic toolset in that area that was highlighted in blue. I can change the width, make that palette wider. I can also drag palettes around, and I can drag tool sets off. These are my tool sets for 3D modeling, visualization, dims and notes, walls, and detailing. If I grab one of those and drag it, you'll see that it tears off the palette, and then I can have that palette on my screen. I can look at these icons with the icon and text, or just the icons. I can sort them manually or ascending alphabetical. So I'll put those back the way they were. Sort by manual placement. So as you start to learn Vectorworks, you might find it easier to leave the icon and text visible, and then later on you might find that it's easier or quicker to go just back to icons. We have the same thing here. We can view tools as icons, icons and text. We can sort tools, and we can also customize our interface. I'm not going to talk about customizing the interface, but if you want to, it's there. Once we've created an object, we might want to change its attributes, change its fill style, change its color, change its line weight, change its opacity, and so on. And we'll come back to look at this attributes in detail when we draw something. We'll also come back and look at detail of our snapping. So we'll come back and look at this later on. When we create an object, the information about that object appears here in the Object Info palette. We can control the class, the layer, the plane, the height and width, and we'll do an exercise where we actually make a change to this object. When nothing is selected, the Object Info palette doesn't really give you much information, which is why I created that object to show you. In our navigation palette, we can look at our classes, at our layers, sheets, and so on. We'll come back and look at navigation as we learn more about Vectorworks. And finally, I wanted to look at the Resource Manager. We can look at the resources that are available in our open files, or in our subscription libraries, or in our Vectorworks libraries, our user libraries, and our workgroup libraries. If you want to hide some of these, we've got buttons at the top here for hiding some parts. So we can hide our subscription libraries, we can hide our user libraries and our workgroup libraries, and we can hide our Vectorworks libraries. When you start to learn Vectorworks a little bit more, you might find it's quite handy to have your Vectorworks libraries or even some favorites available. I find the Resource Manager location just a little bit troublesome. Every time I go to a menu, the Resource Manager likes to open. So what I like to do is to make it smaller and drag it by its title bar. So you just click and hold the title bar down, and I like to have it over here on the top right of my screen, so I don't accidentally activate the Resource Manager when I'm looking for a menu. I'd like you to keep your eye on this area just down the bottom here. Just here where my cursor is. As I move around, or I draw a line, you sometimes notice that there's an X, Y, length and angle available. That will also appear as a floating data bar when I draw something. If I make a mistake, you might notice this area down the bottom here presents you with a red error message. So that can be quite handy if you keep your eye on that. If you lose any palettes, you can go to Window on the menu bar, choose Palettes, and locate the palette that you've closed. If the palette's already open, it has a tick next to it, like this one, Basic. If I click on it again, it will hide that palette. To get it back, Window, Palettes, and Basic, and that will bring it back again. And it will go back to its last location. I'd like to set up my drawing units. File, Document Settings, and Units. I quite like drawing in millimeters. So I can draw in millimeters, I can show the unit mark or not. If you like drawing in feet and inches, you might try feet and inches. and you might want to have fractional rounding style so that you can round to the nearest eighth of an inch, and you can show trailing or leading zeros. So I'm going to set mine up the way that I like, which is millimeters first, decimal precision, rounding to the nearest whole millimeter, square meters with my precision, cubic meters with my precision, and units with my precision. Now that doesn't mean that the way that I like is the perfect way. It does suit the way that I draw. For my dual dimensions, I very much like to draw site plans with meters as my dimensions. I like to show the unit mark. I like to have decimal with 3 decimal places and rounding to the nearest 5 millimeters. And then I can set my trailing and leading zeros, and this will give me units that look really good for my drawings. I'm not going to talk about Enagos, and I'm not going to talk about the structural part either. Let me save those units, and I will call them ArchonCAD. Now it might be that I'm working on a project where feet and inches is important. So I might want to set feet and inches. I might want to have fractional. I might want to have my units in square feet. My volume in cubic yards. My angles are degrees. And my dual dimensions might be feet only. Show unit mark, yes. Decimal, rounding to the nearest whole part. And I could save that as well, and I could call it feet and inches. So what does this give me? Well, it gives me a way of jumping between my standard units and my feet and inches units. So if you're working with clients with multiple settings, it's a great idea to save your units. So I'm going to go back to my ArchonCAD, and I could manage that, and I could rename it and call it millimeters or metric. OK, and OK again. And for the last time, click on the OK button, and we're back to our drawing. Now we might want to set up our page, which is also important. File on the menu bar, page setup. The first thing I'm going to do is to look at my printer setup. I have a printer which is an A3 printer. I like to use A3, which is about 11 by 17 inches. I'm going to make it landscape. And sometimes where I live, we often print drawings either A3 or A1. And the difference between those two page sizes is 50%. If I set my page area or my scaling to 50%, Vectorworks will trick the computer and it'll look like I've got a piece of A1 or a 34-inch page for printing on. So I'm going to make that 100% for today. Okay, and the final thing, make sure that says 1 and 1. I understand you want to choose this part over here, choose size unavailable and print setup. I understand you want to do all that. Don't. Set 1 horizontal, 1 vertical. When you click OK, the page will change. If you click on this button just here, you'll zoom to your page area, and you can see there's a thin border here, thin border there, and at the top and the bottom. We've set up our page and we've set up our units, so now we can draw something. Now I'm going to use millimeters in this particular file, but I will convert those to inches for you. What we'd like to do is learn how to draw something simple. I'd like to start with a rectangle tool. I'd like you to start with the rectangle tool from the basic tool palette. I'd like you to go to the toolbar and choose the first mode, click once to start and click once to finish. Doesn't matter how big you make it, but what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at the Object Info palette. Just here, Object Info. The Object Info palette has 3 panes, a shape, a data, and a render. Under the shape pane, it tells you what kind of object it is. This is an actual rectangle. Even if you make it square, it's still a rectangle. It tells you what class it's on, and you can change its class. It tells you what layer it's on, and you can assign it to a different layer. It tells you the plane and the width and height along with some other information. I'd like you to change the width to 2 inches or 50 millimeters and then hit the Tab key. One of the things you may have noticed is that one edge of the rectangle remained the same and the rest of it came in from the right. When I hit the Tab key, it highlighted the whole of the next field. You don't have to click and drag your cursor across that. So this is also 2 inches or 50 millimeters. Enter. And you may have noticed now that when I changed the size of my rectangle, this side came in and that side came up. In other words, this corner here did not change. This corner was like the origin. And if you have a look over here, you'll notice there's a grid of 9 dots. And the black dot in the middle here is at that top left corner. This is called the box position, but you could think of it as the origin of your rectangle. If you want to move the origin, you could click on that point there, change the X coordinate to 0, hit the Tab key and the rectangle will move across. Change the Y coordinate to 50 and the rectangle will move. Let's change that Y to 0 and it should move down. And so now the corner of my rectangle is at 0, 0 on my page. In other words, right in the middle. So that's the first way to create a rectangle. It's not the quickest way to create a rectangle, but it is extremely quick. Now before we move on, I'd like to click on Window, Data Bar Options, and I'd like you to choose Allow Numeric Keypad Entry for Instant Data Bar Activation. Please ensure that that is selected. The reason I need that selected is because some keyboards have got a numeric keypad on the right hand side and it gives us very quick access to our floating data bar. Click to start a rectangle and go to the center of the first rectangle to click, and you'll see that we can now create a rectangle. And there's this blue bar, which is the floating data bar, and I can now type in 50 or 2 inches, 50 millimeters, hit the Tab key, minus 2 inches or minus 50 millimeters, enter once just to see what it looks like, and enter again to confirm. Now you can click with your mouse if you like after that first enter, but I find it much quicker just to hit enter twice. Let me show you why it's so quick. So click to start, we go 50, tab, minus 50, enter once, enter again, and it is a very quick way to create objects. So that's the floating data bar. It is extremely useful. Do keep your eye on it. You'll notice there's a difference when you're creating rectangles or lines. Lines tend to give you a length and an angle, whereas a rectangle tends to give you X and Y. Now if you want to interrupt anything that you're drawing, if I start drawing a line for example, and I click to start and I want to escape, I can hit the escape key. That'll get me right out of it. If it's an object that has multiple clicks, I'll go back to the rectangle tool, so click, click. If I hit the backspace key or the delete key, it undoes my last click. Do that again and I'm right back to where I started. So that's a couple of different ways to make a rectangle. One final way to make a rectangle, double click on the rectangle tool. This will bring up a dialog box. Many objects in Vectorworks have this ability. If you double click on them, you can bring up this dialog box to create an object. I want the width to be 50 millimeters or 2 inches, the height to be 50 millimeters or 2 inches. I want the box position, that's the origin there at the top left, and I want position at next click turned on. Now there are times where you do not want to have position at next click. You want to turn that off and you physically want to type in where you want that corner to be. I'm going to turn on position next click again. Click OK, find the center of your last rectangle. There it is there. It'll also say bottom right because it's finding the bottom right of the rectangle underneath. Click, and we've now got 3 rectangles. Now it's important to recognize that these 3 rectangles are stacked up one on top of the other. I'm going to go back to my selection tool. Notice when I drag them and I drag them on top of each other, they look like they're stacked up. I'll just undo that. So I'll put them back. So there's something in Vectorworks called the stacking order. So when we have an object in Vectorworks, we can right click on that and we can send forward, back, or send to the back, and that puts that rectangle at the bottom of everything. Right click on it again, send to front, brings it to the front of absolutely everything. send backward and send forward will move that object one object in the stacking order. And when there's only 3, it doesn't matter so much. But if there was 100 objects, you could do an awful lot of send backward, send backward, send backward to get what you want. In this lesson, you learned how to navigate around the Vectorworks interface. You learned how to access tools and palettes. You learned how to set up the required units. You learned how to set up page areas for printing. And you learned how to create basic objects.